Good afternoon, everyone. It is an honor to welcome you all to the webinar today on menopause and bone health. On behalf of Jacksonpal Pharmaceuticals Limited, makers of Endorec tablets and Lycorate soft gel, I am Dr. Vipin Tyagi, along with my teammates, Dr. Deepika Chabra and Mr. Amit Saxena. This ICOG accredited webinar is organized by Endometriosis Committee of AOGD in association with Noida Obs-Gynae Society. Many thanks to Dr. Manju Khemani, Chairperson, Endometriosis Committee of AOGD, and President Dr. Sujata Bhatt, Noida Obs-Gynae Society, along with Dr. Anshu Raina, Secretary NOGS, for organizing this webinar. We welcome the chairpersons, AOGD President Dr. Mala Srivastava, for sparing time from her busy schedule, and Dr. Mitra Saxena, past President Rewari Obs-Gynae Society and North Zone Coordinator Ethics and Medical Legal Committee, FOXY, currently contesting for the post of Chairperson Practical Obstetrics Committee, FOXY. It will be a pleasure to listen to the speaker of the day, Dr. Manju Khemani, on endometriosis, followed by panel moderated by Dr. Chitra Setia, past President NOGS, on bone health in menopause. In the panel, we have Dr. Jyoti Bhaskar, VP Delhi Gynae Forum East, Dr. Meethi Bhanot, Consultant Obs-Gynae Apollo Hospital, Noida, Dr. Rajiv Thukral, Associate Director Ortho AIMS Faridabad, Dr. Sujata Bhatt, President Noida Obs-Gynae Society, Dr. Shehla Jamal, Founder and President Society of Menstrual Disorders and Hygiene Management, Dr. Yuvakshi Juneja, Senior Consultant, Mulchand Medicity and Apollo Cradle Royal, Delhi. Welcome to all attendees present with us today. We hope that you all enjoy the session today. Please note, this webinar is brought to you as knowledge sharing initiative by Jacksonpal Medical Services, and this session is streaming on Facebook Live. The recording will remain on Jacksonpal's YouTube channel for reference and knowledge sharing. We request all attendees to please post your queries by text in Q&A box, which will be answered at the end. Due to the time constraint, please share your questions during the webinar itself as text. I will now request Dr. Anshu Raina ma'am to kindly initiate the session.
Thank you, Bipin, for your kind words. And I welcome you all from Noida Obs-Gynae Society to our all dignitaries, famous, well-known face. They don't need any introduction at all. So first of all, for a to chair this session, I would like to call Mala Srivastava ma'am. So Dr. Mala Srivastava is a senior consultant at Sir Gangaram Hospital, and she is a senior endoscopic and robotic surgeon. And ma'am is please chair the session for today's webinar. Now the next chairperson is Dr. Mitra Saxena. Dr. Mitra Saxena is a director of Sri Ashwini Saxena Hospital, Rewari, and she is one of a well-known, famous, we all are knowing, whoever is sitting here, and the rest of all over India. So please, ma'am, come and chair the session for today's webinar.
Yeah, I bring greetings from AOGD, and it's my pleasure to be part of this webinar. And it's also my privilege to introduce the star speaker of the day, Dr. Manju Khemani. Dr. Manju Khemani is the chairperson of the Endometriosis Committee of AOGD. She has been past professor at Lady Hardinge Medical College. Madam had been Director, Department of Obs-Gynae, Max Smart Super Specialty Hospital, New Delhi, ex-professor, Lady Hardinge Medical College, Chairperson, Endometriosis Committee of AOGD, past Chairperson, Safe Motherhood Committee of AOGD, Fellowship in Advanced Gynecological Endoscopy done at Bombay Endoscopy Academy and Center for Minimally Invasive Surgery, Mumbai. She has been past President of DGFS, past review editor of Jogi, and recipient of Abdul Kalam Award. Ma'am, we are waiting to hear from you. Over to you, Dr. Manju, for your scientific deliberation.
Thank you, Dr. Mala, for the
Dr.
kind
Manju,
words. Yeah.
Dr. Manju, can I say a few lines before you
Sure,
start?
sure, Dr. Mitra, sure.
I want to really thank AOGD family, Noida OB-Gynae family, because the amount of love and support and respect and trust I've received from you people is very, very heartening for me. Winning and losing is a part of life, but what I have gained in the last 2.5 months is something I will never, never forget. Some wonderful moments with all of you in different platforms and so much of knowledge. And now I'm very happy that today's day, instead of passing in anxiety, I'm going to be learning. For last 2.5 months, I'm totally in practical obstetrics. Thanks to AOGD, thanks to Noida, thanks to Dr. Sujata Bhatt. You know, she has been with me from my day one webinar and the Jackson Park. And Dr. Manju Khemani, I've heard you so many times. Gave me my, lovely opportunity to chair a session where you're going to impart knowledge. So without acting like a big knowledge bank in endometriosis, I leave the stage open for you. And I want to say my thanks to Ma'am Mala Srivastava. Ma'am, you've been such a positive support in everybody. Thank you. That's it. Dr. Manju Khemani, I'm waiting to hear you.
Dr. Mitra, all the best. Let's hope you
Thank
win, right?
Yeah, all the best,
Thank
Dr.
you, ma'am,
Mitra.
for your kind words.
Thank you.
I'm going to speak on paradigm shift in the management of endometriosis. We all have been bombarded with the, multiple webinars on endometriosis. So you must also be sick of listening to endometriosis, But I'll make sure, that I only speak, as something which you have not heard, Let's see whether I can fulfill my promise. So just to recap, all of you know that endometriosis is a common gynecological disorder which is defined by the presence of endometrial implants at the extrauterine sites. It leads to chronic inflammation, pain, and infertility. As far as its incidence is concerned, if you're seeing the general population, it is 11%. But if you're seeing patients who are suffering from pain and infertility, then incidence could be as high as 35 to 50%. And it is the second most common indication for surgery in a woman before the age of menopause. So we all know that this disease has three common manifestations: superficial peritoneal endometriosis, endometrioma, and DIE. So all these three disease patterns, they will have endometrial glands, stroma, along with the nerve, blood vessels, and inflammatory cells. And all these elements, they contribute to a variety of symptoms depending on the organs involved. Ovarian endometrioma is the commonest manifestation, which we see in 44% of women. And it is associated with deep endometriosis, ovarian adhesion, and pouch of Douglas obliteration. So what is its implication for us gynecologists? The implication is that in case your radiologist tells you that there's an endometrioma and you are trying to operate on, book extra OT time. And the surgeon has to be really comfortable, because if you just do stripping and remove the cyst, and if you do not free the pouch of Douglas, which is obliterated, you have done half the job. This is what it looks like when you put the scope. So I'm going to speak what is new in endometriosis. I'm not going to speak about the risk factors. Let's see about the pathogenesis. So from the MBBS to, post-graduation, we have all read about all these theories, retrograde menstruation, vascular and lymphatic dissemination, and stem cell metaplasia. So let's leave this, This is what endometriosis looks like, a site of the uterosacral, and retrograde menstruation is there. Now, retrograde menstruation is seen in so many patients, but everybody does not develop endometriosis. Why? Because these patients who develop endometriosis, their NK cells are defective. These NK cells are not able to remove these endometrium which is shed in the peritoneal cavity. Now, if you take a biopsy from a patient who has endometrium biopsy, from a patient who has an endometriosis, from a patient who does not have endometriosis. So you have two patients, one who has endometriosis, one who does not have. And you have taken an endometrium biopsy from both the patients. Is this biopsy different? If you see this histopathologically, both the biopsies will look same, right? But if you go at a molecular level, what will you find? That a patient who has endometriosis, her endometrium has higher aromatase enzyme activity, which converts androgen to estrogen. Secondly, this patient also has dysregulation of selected genes. These genes, they contribute to implantation and apoptotic response. These, the functional layer of eutopic endometrium, that is functional layer of the endometrium tissue, it has more nerve tissue if you stain it with the immunohistochemically. And this also explains that once you have done the complete removal of both the cysts, cleared the pelvis of all endometriosis. Still patient has pain because these nerve fibers are there inside the endometrium lining. So in 2019, new theories came that there is an increased estrogen receptor activity and local production, and there is a progesterone resistance. We all know that there are two kinds of progesterone receptors, A and B. Progesterone B, what it does, it opposes inflammation. And progesterone receptor A, it promotes inflammation. So in endometriosis, the progesterone receptor B, it is markedly reduced. That means the progesterone which is opposing inflammation receptor, that is very reduced, and progesterone receptor A is overexpressed. There is also progesterone resistance, right, which dampens the anti-estrogenic effect of progesterone, and it amplifies the local estrogenic effect. All the treatment which we are giving to these endometriosis patients, what we do, we reduce the estrogen level, right? Because this disease is dependent on the estrogen signaling. So these patients, they have increased expression of both the receptors, alpha and beta, because they also have the capability of locally forming estrogen from the androgen because they have more of aromatase activity. The important discovery that this enzyme is there in the local endometrial tissue, which is producing estrogen, you know, this explains, because when we have done the complete hysterectomy, patient is absolutely low estrogen. But again, endometriosis comes up because these locally aromatase produces estrogen, and endometriosis, which the cells which are remaining, they again redevelop. These patients, they also have a lot of inflammatory activity. And as I said, that NK cell activity is disturbed in them. So these NK cells are not able to remove the shed endometrium cells from the peritoneal cavity, and that's why they develop endometriosis. Now, these patients also have augmented production of CC chemokines and their peritoneal fluids, which also promotes inflammation. Many times of these endometriosis patients, when you do TVS, the report will be there's the endometrioma and there's a free fluid. This free fluid is promoting inflammation in these patients. So to summarize, pathogenesis, there is increased estrogen sensitivity, there's progesterone resistance, increased inflammation, and these three things together, they lead to pain and infertility. We all know about the neuroangiogenesis in endometriosis, and I'm not going to talk about it. So pathogenesis is same, whether it's an endometrioma, whether it's superficial endometriosis, whether it is a deep infiltrating endometriosis. Coming to its symptom, these days the call is, do not do laparoscopy, do not diagnose endometriosis, do laparoscopy just to diagnose endometriosis. So we have to diagnose these patients clinically, and which symptoms tells us that this patient could be having endometriosis. One symptom is that they have menstrual related persistent chronic pelvic pain, and this has the highest sensitivity and specificity. Superficial dyspareunia has got no correlation. If a patient has deep dyspareunia, or this patient has menstrual dysuria or menstrual dyschezia, all these symptoms point to the endometriosis. One important symptom which we always ignore, fatigue. These patients, they complain that they have fatigue. So we all know that, you know, from diagnosis to treatment, it almost takes, there's a lag of 4-8 years, depending on which age group patient is this. As is that, what happens, more adhesions form, more symptoms increase, and they have central sensitization. Once the central sensitization develops, then they have, you know, pain everywhere. Now this is a photograph where, you know, we have removed the one of the fallopian tube, cleared the pathology. So what is the mechanism of infertility still, you know? So mechanism of infertility is changes in the peritoneal fluid. As I said, peritoneal fluid promotes inflammation in these patients. There is a reduced sperm and tubal motility, decreased possibility of gamete fertilization, there are a lot of adhesions, and overall the ovarian reserve is low. So all these factors together, they lead to infertility. What about the diagnosis? Now in 1980, the incidence was only 2.5%. It has increased to 10%. Has the incidence actually increased? Maybe because the first pregnancy is postponed, or maybe there is an improvement in the diagnosis. So as I said, to diagnose endometriosis, clinical symptoms are the most important. Persistent pain, chronic pain during menstruation, dysmenorrhea, and fatigue, right? These three symptoms should not be ignored. We all know about the gynecological evaluation about the nodularity. two important diagnostic modality, ultrasound, MRI, they come to our rescue. Now, we all know that endometrioma in ultrasound, it gives a appearance of ground glass appearance. Less than 4 compartment, reduced vascularity, and no papillae. Or you may find kissing ovaries. We can also diagnose bladder endometriosis. How will you diagnose bladder endometriosis? On transvaginal sonography, you will find thickening and you will find protrusion inside the bladder lumen. These two are the diagnostic characteristic of bladder endometriosis. If an ultrasound says that patient has endometrioma, now the signal should be open, right? The antenna should be open, and you should ask your radiologist. He follow International Deep Endometriosis Analysis Group this thing features. IDEA group has given us that these are the characteristics to diagnose deep infiltrating endometriosis. And whenever you are sending a patient of endometrioma to rule out that there is no DIE, do the bowel preparation, because if you don't do the bowel preparation, your radiologist will not do the good job. You may not know all these, but your radiologist should have this ready reckoner to tell us that yes, this patient has endometriosis at this place or at this place. So radiologist should be familiar with the IDEA group of diagnosis. Now, what is the value of ultrasound? According to Cochrane meta-analysis, transvaginal ultrasound, it approaches the sensitivity and specificity which is needed to replace surgery for endometrioma detection. That means you need not do a laparoscopy to confirm that yes, this is an endometrioma. Good ultrasound is good enough. Secondly, expert guided imaging is outlined by the IDEA group will help improve clinical assessment across endometriosis manifestation. Now, all these things together, they coexist. And how many percentages? OMA with superficial endometriosis persists in 30% cases. OMA with DIE in 30% cases. We should know this, because if you alone do just a cystectomy and you leave behind DIE, we have done the half job. And DIE with adenomyosis is seen in the 49% cases. Like IDEA group, MUSA consensus is there to diagnose adenomyosis. This MUSA consensus has given us these 8 things to diagnose adenomyosis. What are these? The posterior wall asymmetrical thickening, these in myometrial cyst, hyperechoic areas in the myometrium, striations, and these loss of the endomyometrial junctions. So these all 5-6 characteristics, because so many times you get an ultrasound of 25-year-old and the radiologist has written adenomyosis, and then you worry, 25-year-old, how can she have adenomyosis? So you should tell your radiologist, please follow these MUSA consensus guidelines. The MRI is the most accurate for non-invasive diagnosis of DIE and adenomyosis. All these biomarkers have got absolutely no value. We all do CA-125 in every cases of endometrioma. But according to guidelines, this CA-125 has only value when the disease is recurring. You need not do this in every patient. What is the role of MRI in endometriosis? When should you do it? You should only do MRI in endometriosis when you are suspecting deep infiltrating endometriosis or when you are in a dilemma, right? It should not be done routinely in every patient. And another thing, MRI cannot pick up superficial peritoneal endometriosis. But when you are sending the patient for MRI, important thing is that you must talk to your radiologist. What? Give intravenous contrast for the bladder visualization. Put a vaginal and rectal gel contrast for better visualization of rectovaginal septum. And by this way, 1 millimeter slices, you will be able to stage endometriosis before you do the laparoscopy. So this is the best way to diagnose and stage endometriosis, but provided this particular whole thing is followed. Those babies who have neonatal bleeding, they later on are more likely to have endometriosis. Now coming to novelty of therapies. So before 2019, we were doing laparoscopy before putting the patient on treatment, right? So this Charles Chepran, he's the past president of SUIT. He has started this movement, and he says in 2019, there is no place for diagnostic laparoscopy when you are suspecting clinically endometriosis. Endometriosis can be suspected without surgical exploration. Even the NICE guidelines these days say that medical treatment can be prescribed without histological confirmation of diagnosis. So what we were being taught that when you do a laparoscopy, you take a biopsy and you confirm all that thing is out. Once you have clinically diagnosed endometriosis, start treatment. You need not confirm it by the histopathology. And diagnosis of endometriosis should no longer be considered as synonym of immediate surgery. What was our thinking all these while? Suppose a 21-year-old patient has come to me with the pain and she has 5 centimeter endometrioma. Only treatment I would suggest, let's take her for the laparoscopy. But that has changed. There is a rethinking in endometriosis. Why? Because for clinically diagnosed symptomatic endometriosis, lifelong medical treatment is first line option. I repeat, if you've diagnosed endometriosis, first line of option is medical treatment for pain, except when the patient wants to become pregnant. Then it's a different story. The new surgical concept is one surgery only in endometriosis life. Why it has come? Because what happens at 21 years, this girl has come to me. I say, I'm a very good surgeon. I remove that cystectomy and I put her on the treatment. She takes treatment for 1 year, then she leaves it. After 4 or 5 years, she again develops endometriosis because it's a chronic disease. She goes to another doctor. The doctor says, I'm a better surgeon than Dr. Khemani, and it's second surgery. And the story goes on. Now, we as surgeons may think that if I do surgery, pain relief will be better. If I give medicine, pain relief will not be better. So here is a systematic review and meta-analysis. It compared two groups of patients, one who were given medical treatment, one who were given and underwent surgery. What was the result? There was no statistically significant difference in the pain improvement between surgical and medical treatment. And the conclusion of this meta-analysis, which was published in 2017, it said, we believe this study may encourage clinicians to consider a less invasive alternative for treating their patients' chronic pelvic pain in the near future. Now, there's so many good surgeons these days. I mean, they do a fantastic job, but we must understand that surgical removal of pelvic endometriotic tissue, even by the most capable surgeon, will not be curative. That means even if you have done the complete removal, patient will have recurrence. So what is the advantage of surgery? The advantage of surgery is it's a definitive diagnosis. See and treat. You are excluding all other pathologies. You can stage the disease. It immediately alleviates the pain. And plus 50 to 70% of patients can conceive immediately. So improved chance of fertility. Plus it restores anatomy. What is the limitation? Surgery depends on the surgeon. And you cannot, it's invasive and you cannot avoid the risk. You may injure bladder, you may injure ureter, you may injure rectum. So when is surgery indicated? We can't say that surgery is not indicated at all. So surgery is indicated. So whenever you are doing laparoscopy, it should be ideally diagnostic and therapeutic. It is indicated when pelvic pain is not responding to medical treatment. When there is a contraindication to medical therapy, when your patient has a DIE and you have given the medical therapy, it has failed, or if you are suspecting malignancy, or there is infertility with associated factor, extragenital endometriosis also does not respond usually to medical management and it requires surgery. But surgery should be done at the right time for the patient. We all know about the recurrence, right? After 3 years in stage 3 and 4, 90% patient will have recurrence. And prevention of this recurrence after surgery is the most important thing. So what should you do after you have done the surgery? If patient does not require pregnancy, put her on the adjuvant hormonal treatment. If she wishes pregnancy, let her take the infertility treatment depending on what are the other factors, whether she can conceive with IUI, whether she needs ART. Practice committee of ASRM in 2008 had said that there is no permanent cure for endometriosis. It should be viewed as a chronic disease that requires a lifelong management plan with the goal of maximizing the use of medical treatment and avoiding repeated surgical procedures. So we should imbibe this, that no repeated surgical procedures in these patients. Now coming to medical treatment, no single treatment is ideal for all patients. Since it's a chronic disease and you have to give the treatment for a long time, so you have to see the cost, the long-term safety, and what treatment is available in which country. How long you should give treatment, it still needs consensus, but the logic is continue it till she reaches the menopause. So this is, these excerpts are taken from an article which says don'ts in endometriosis. What it does says, do not perform laparoscopy in an adolescent woman less than 20 years with moderate to severe dysmenorrhea and clinically suspected early endometriosis without prior attempting to relieve symptoms. So if a patient of 20 years, 21 comes to you with the chronic dysmenorrhea, please give her medical treatment first. So now first line treatment is in medical treatment, OCPs, whether continuous or whether, in 21 days, gynecologists, any other progestogens or oral, this thing, intrauterine device, Mirena. In second line is GnRH analog and GnRH antagonist, right? All the guidelines, ACOG, ASRM, ASHRAE, every guideline says OCP should be the first line of treatment for endometriosis. What does the evidence say? Now, if you see the randomized control trial, there are hardly any randomized control trial. I could only find one randomized placebo control trial, which was done by Hada et al. And what did it show? That only 50% patient had relief in the endometriosis with OCP. Mind it, it does not give 100% relief. There was another very good study where 8 countries had participated. And what did it show? That 70% of women, they had used multiple OCP. That means 40% had they have been prescribed between 3 and 10 different OCP during this study. Why? One OCP was given, patient did not respond, patient was switched to another OCP, variety, then another, like that. So we all know that OCPs will give relief with 50% and everybody will not have a relief with the OCP. Now, whether estrogen is good or whether progesterone is good, let's just go through this slide. So we all know that endometriosis implants, they demonstrate resistance to the progesterone. Right? We just seen it pathogenesis, and they have augmented estrogen activity. All the low dosage OCP, say Crescent or anything, they contain 20 to 30 microgram of ethinyl estradiol. So 5 microgram of ethinyl estradiol, it is equivalent to 1 milligram of micronized estradiol, which we are giving as HRT, which patient needs, or 0.625 milligram of CE, conjugated equine estrogen. That means when you are giving OCP to a patient, it is equivalent to 4 to 6 times the physiological dosage of estrogen you are giving to the patient when you are giving the OCP. This Dizerga and Mercelinelli, they suggested that presence of supraphysiological concentration of estrogen when you are giving OCP, what it will do, so whatever endometrial cells which are dying, it will rescue them also, right? And large doses of estrogen and OCP should lead to progression of disease. So that's why, logically going through all these studies, I feel estrogen, progesterone, OCP is not the best management for the endometriosis. Another thing is that when you are giving OCP, because these patients need long-term treatment, so you have given, say, for 4 years OCP. Now, what will this OCP do? It will make the uterine lining very thin. And then this thin lining, these patients, when they want to conceive, they do not respond very well. So why progestin? What is so good about progestin? We know that progestin, when you are giving continuously, it will inhibit ovulation, it will induce amenorrhea, it will also decrease gonadotropin secretion, but they do not cause hypogonadotrophic, hypoestrogenic state, which is going to deplete the woman's bone, right? There will be still enough estrogen. So we have achieved the same thing by progestin. Progestins, they have an anti-inflammatory effect, they have an anti-angiogenic effect, and both of these have a beneficial effect on the progression of endometriosis, right? It may decrease, progestins may decrease expression of matrix metalloproteinase, which decreases the invasiveness of endometriosis implants. So, and progestin only therapy may be as effective for pain relief as a second line therapy like gonadotropins. So, based on the control trial, what we can say, women with suspected or confirmed endometriosis, they do better with the oral progestin only treatment as the first line therapy. Now coming to surgery versus ART, right? I'll come to that later on in my talk. So what is our current approach? A patient has come with the ultrasound or the clinical diagnosis of endometriosis, and what you do immediately for surgery. And after that, you put her on the medical therapy, which patient may take, may not take, and then patient has repetitive surgery, and ultimately with the poor ovarian reserve, she goes for the ART. This is our current approach. So this is what Charles Chapran said, that surgery must be performed when the patient wants to be pregnant. So what is the new strategy? Surgery should be only once in the lifetime of the patient, and long-term medical treatment should be given to these patients. So rethinking endometriosis, how? No immediate desire for pregnancy, lifelong medical treatment as the first therapeutic option. It's not saying that you give the progesterone or OCP, that is your choice. If she desires pregnancy and AMH is low, then ART, or otherwise, if patient is too much pain, then you can decide about surgery. So how will you decide about the surgery? Now, if the patient says, no, I want to undergo surgery, Well, you can't do help it. If patient is young, good AMH, you can take her up for surgery. If the infertility duration is short, you can take her up for surgery because then she'll conceive very faster and she has no associated infertility factor. If she has not undergone any other surgery and she has an intense pelvic pain, now these are the patients at the time when they are willing to conceive, they will do best with the surgery. So now how do we have to modify our treatment? Once you have diagnosed endometriosis, then put her on the long-term medical treatment. Don't even think of surgery. Now she has got married and she's come to you that I want to become pregnant. Then you can think of single time that, clear her pelvis, remove this thing, and either she can conceive on her own or you do her ART. And then after she has finished her family, put her on the long medical treatment till she has reached menopause. This should be the ideal management. The other way is that patient has come to you with the clinical diagnosis of endometriosis. You put her again on the long-term medical management. Don't do any surgery because you think that she will do better with ART. Straight away take her for the ART. After she has finished her family, then put her on the long medical managed treatment. And before she is, when she is about to reach menopause, then you can think of doing the definitive surgery. So once these patients they conceive, remember that they are high-risk patients. They are likely to have preterm labor, and they are likely to have placental problem. We are worried, when there's a diagnosis of endometrioma, that she could be harboring a cancer. So incidence of clear cell carcinoma is only 5%, and endometrioid adenocarcinoma is only 3%. It's very rare. So I talk about this molecule Dynogest, right? How does it work? Its mechanism of action is that it helps in the progesterone resistance. It has an anti-estrogenic effect. It has pro-apoptic effect. It has an anti-inflammatory effect, and it's an anti-neurogenic, angiogenic effect. That means whatever you can think which will help in endometriosis, it has. And Dynogest is available, I think, everywhere except I think in UK. Still, it's not available. The dosage is 2 milligrams. Now, how long you can give it? So here is a study by Romer. Romer has done a lot of work on the Dynogest. So he chose these patients and before surgery and after surgery. This is the VAS score, pain score, and for 5 years continuously he gave them the Dynogest. And as you can see, the pain really reduced in both the groups, before surgery as well as after surgery. So we can give Dynogest continuously without break for 5 years. We are worried that Dynogest does not reduce the estrogen to below 20 milligrams. So the bone loss is not there that much as in it does reduce the bone loss, but not as much as the GnRH. So all these hot flushes, vaginal dryness, they do not happen as you see in the GnRH analog. The only side effect in my practice which I've seen is the headache, right? Other things I haven't come across. What happens to their period? So 28 to 24, that means this are approximately 52% patients are very happy. They are in the place because they don't have periods or very few periods. 22% patient, they have scanty period. 3 to 4% patient, they have frequent prolonged period. Now, how do you deal with a patient who has frequent prolonged period? She gets disgusted here. Do a transvaginal sonography. If the TVS shows that the endometrium lining is 5 millimeter or more, increase Dynogest to 2 milligram BD. If the endometrium lining is 2 millimeter, this patient needs addition of Proguanova for 7 days. That's how you manage this frequent and prolonged bleeding. Now, what is the effect of Dynogest on reducing the endometrioma volume? So, as you can see, this is the group of patients where they gave Norethistron, and this is the patient where they gave Dynogest. And as you can see in these patients, what was the conclusion of this study? That both oral administration of Dynogest and Norethistron can reduce the size of ovarian endometrioma. Norethistron is our Primolet, Registron. In comparison to Norethistron, Dynogest was more effective in reducing endometriosis-related symptoms, both after 6 months and 12 months of treatment. These findings suggest that both the drugs, but in particular, Dynogest may represent a valid therapeutic option for the management of endometrioma in order to avoid or delay surgery, even in short-term administration. What about after surgery, right? So, Siu et al., they have done this work, right? It's a prospective study. So, after surgery, they made 2 groups. One group, they have given initially GnRH followed by COC, and the other group, they have given Dynogest for 24 months, 2 years. And no case of pain or endometrium recurrence was found after 24 months with the Dynogest. This study has been published in 2019. Many times, you do surgery and patient after sometimes comes back with the recurrence. Now what you do? So here are two studies, right? So this Koshiba et al, they gave Dynogest to these patients who had recurrence. And after 24 months, what they found? The complete resolution of recurrent endometrium was found in almost 57%. Similarly, Lee et al also showed, that the size had decreased in these cases of recurrent endometrium. Coming to DIE. So this particular study published in 2011 showed that, it causes reduction of lesion size Dynogest, and it also causes relief of symptoms which are related with the extragenital lesion. Here's another study which was published in the European Journal in 2017. What does it show? The size of the DIE does not decrease, but all the symptoms decrease and the quality of life is better. So in nutshell, indication for Dynogest in all three groups, it's a first line treatment. You can give it as long-term treatment, and you can also use it as a, I'm not a spokesperson for any of the drug company, but this is what I personally feel. Now, so many preparations are available now, some containing Dynogest, some containing Dynogest with ethinyl estradiol, and you are tempted, which one should I use? So here is a study, right? So they took 40 patients in Dynogest group and 41 patients in Dynogest plus ethinyl estradiol group. What was the conclusion of this study? They had ovarian endometrium. The VAS score was 19 and it was 18. The ovarian cyst size reduced markedly in the Dynogest group and not only 13% reduction in the Dynogest plus ethinyl estradiol group. So if you have endometrioma, instead of using a combination of Dynogest plus ethinyl estradiol, it is better to use alone Dynogest. You can also use it in adenomyosis. Only thing is, if the patient is anemic, please don't use it because sometimes they can have frequent and very prolonged bleeding, which will worsen the situation. Thank you very much for the patient sharing.
Thank you, ma'am. That was really a very comprehensive deliberation on what is new in the pathogenesis, investigation, and management of endometriosis. I'm sure everybody will have really benefited from your deliberation. Any questions from the audience?
Dr. Mala,
Mitra, you want to say something?
Yeah, I would just like to say one thing that Dr. Manju, its life has come a full circle with endometriosis, the enigmatic disease, to its understanding the pathogenesis even more intricately. And we remember that we were taught the sandwich therapy and how beautifully you have explained that it should be only one-time surgery because this disease doesn't finish off unless the ovaries and all the estrogen producing things are out of the body. And I think that was such a wonderful lecture. I'm so happy to say that even this is a closed door meeting and we have 278 people, and I can imagine everybody is listening very carefully to whatever you've said. Dr. Manju, wonderful lecture. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Extremely informative talk, Dr. Manju. This paradigm shift was so important for all of us to know. And there's so much new in what you had told us compared to the usual lectures we hear on endometriosis. That was really wonderful. Now we go on to the panel discussion, which is going to be moderated by Dr. Chitra. We had done this actually a little earlier in a smaller group. And then I found it was so informative. I told Dr. Chitra, we have to impart all this knowledge to the rest of our group. So that is why we are having it again. And Dr. Chitra will now take over.
Manju's talk, this was excellent, Dr. Manju, and we learned so much from it that everyone should be sure that don't go on and on about surgery. That's the best thing. Okay, now we are going to talk something completely different, that we are talking on menopause and bone health. And it's a different topic totally. We're not going to talk about the other aspects of menopause. We're only going to talk about bone health. And I learned a lot after preparing for this panel discussion, because this is one aspect which as gynecologists, we really don't pay attention to. So what is our dream? To be fit at 40, strong at 60, and independent at 80. All of you know the first two. I hope all of you know the last one also. She's an 82-year-old shooter dadi, she's called, Chandra Tomar, and she's absolutely independent and fit at 80. So what is menopause? We know all about menopause. FSH more than 10 is indicative of declining ovarian function. More than 20 are diagnostic of ovarian failure in the perimenopausal age group with vasomotor symptoms, even in the absence of cessation of menstruation. And more than 40 done 2 months apart is diagnostic of menopause, in which AMH becomes undetectable, inhibin levels fall, and antral follicular count and ovarian volume decrease. But menstrual irregularity is the only objective marker to define and establish menopause. Now, types of menopause, all of us know: natural or spontaneous menopause, perimenopause, 1 year this way and 1 year that way, senescence is the period after the age of 60, premature menopause is spontaneous menopause occurring 2 standard deviations below the mean estimated age for the reference population, traditionally below the age of 40, but in India, it's even taken as 38 years. Induced menopause, cessation of menstruation that follows bilateral oophorectomy or iatrogenic ablation of ovarian function. And early menopause is between the age of 40 and the accepted typical age of menopause. Now, the Indian standards are very different from the Caucasians ones. And in India, an average female life expectancy in 2011 was 68 years. And by next year, it is expected to be 73 years. The estimated mean age of menopause is 46 years in India and is lower than that of the Caucasians. What is more important as far as we are concerned are that osteoporotic fractures occur 10 to 20 years earlier in Indians compared to Caucasians. The mean bone mineral density in India is about 2 standard deviations lower than in women in the Western population. And to a large extent, I think it is because of the exercise regime. In the West, people are more independent. They're doing all the housework themselves. Whereas we, after the age of 60, we have lots of people to do things for us. Prevalence of low bone mass is to the extent of 40% from the age of 40 years, increases to 62% by the age of 60 years, and as high as 80% by the age of 65 years. There is an early age of presentation of fracture, and accelerated bone loss is in the immediate 5 years of menopause. Up to 20% of bone loss can happen during menopause. And basically the common symptoms, as we all know, are back pain, loss of 2 inches of height, kyphosis, bone fractures. Now, what is the doctor's role? As far as menopause and aging is concerned, whether the woman is asymptomatic or symptomatic, our aim is to aim for preventive health. Now, Dr. Sujata, let's start with you. What is the WHO definition of osteopenia and osteoporosis?
Osteoporosis is actually a systemic skeletal disorder where there is gradual reduction in the bone mass and also a deterioration in the microarchitecture. Now, the WHO defines it on the basis of bone mineral density and the T-score. The bone mineral density is actually measured by the DEXA, and it assesses your bone mass in comparison to an young adult who is 30 years old. So compared to the bone mass of the young adult. So the T-score is actually a mathematical term. It's a standard deviation. So if you are standard deviation to this mean, that is the bone mass of the young adult. So if you are +1 or -1 of above or below the mean, then you're normal. But as you go below -1 to -2.5, WHO defines it as osteopenic, or it is 10 to 25% less in the bone mass compared to the average adult. And if you go below -2.5, it defines it as osteoporosis, which is 25% less bone mass as compared to the 30-year-old adult. And even a severe osteoporotic situation is when you have -2.5 standard deviation with fractures, fragile fractures. So that's the WHO definition.
Yeah. Now, what are the major risk factors for osteoporosis? Dr. Yuvakshi?
The most important risk factor for osteoporosis is age. With increasing age, osteoporosis progressively increases. Then we, of course, have low body mass index. Then there are factors like lack of exercise, poor exposure to sunlight, poor nutrition. Also important is prior history of a fracture, prior history of, parental history of a hip fracture, And then we have factors which may lead to secondary osteoporosis, like chronic use of glucocorticoids, rheumatoid arthritis, thyroid dysfunction, type 2 diabetes mellitus, collagen vascular disorders, and irritable bowel syndrome. These are the most common factors.
Okay. Smoking and alcohol also play a role.
Smoking and alcohol I mentioned, I think.
Yeah. Okay. What are the important points to be looked for in a physical examination? Dr. Mithi?
Yes. In the physical examination, the most important is the gait of the patient as she walks into our OPD, whether she has a waddling gait. Then does she complain of any decrease in the height? You know, she may either notice it herself, or when we go on examination, we see the spine of the patient, that is there any kyphosis, scoliosis. We ask the patient to stand just next to the wall so that her occiput, if she's able to touch her occiput to the wall, then that rules out any kyphosis. Then secondly, we check for any deformities in the bones in the wrist joint. We ask her to spread out her fingers. And if she can easily spread it out, it rules out any deformities. Then, we ask her to spread her fingers between the rib cage and the anterior superior iliac spine. So if she can easily do that, then that implies a normal spine. But if she's not, then it implies a fracture in the lumbar region. So these are the things we need to look in the physical examination.
What are the laboratory tests you would advise, Dr. Sneha, Sheila?
So lab test, as I feel that this is the best opportunity for a menopausal woman to assess her for other systemic illnesses as well, in addition to osteoporosis and osteopenia. So general investigations like CBC, ESR, CRP can be ordered, urine routine microscopy, culture sensitivity can be done if she is symptomatic, and blood sugar screening can also be performed. Other investigations like DEXA scan, which Sujata ma'am has very nicely explained, that can be offered to the patient. In addition to that, secondary causes like parathyroid hormone deficiency, thyroid hormone dysfunctions can be assessed, and we should assess calcium, vitamin D, and alkaline phosphatase levels. And as Dr. Mithi has highlighted that we should thoroughly examine her. So if there are some subtle signs and symptoms of fragility fractures, then X-ray can also be offered to that patient.
Yeah, I think X-ray should be mandatory if they're coming with any such symptoms.
Symptoms, yes, yeah.
How would you go about screening and diagnosis, Dr. Jyoti?
Yeah, so Dr. Chitra, what I would like to specify, because everyone has talked about the clinical examination and everything, that early diagnosis of osteoporosis is extremely important, because if we tend to diagnose it early and we are able to treat it, we're going to reduce the fractures and then the morbidity and the mortality. So how do we actually look at these patients? So as you had already said in one of the slides, it's prevention that is most important. So our Indian Menopausal Society guidelines says very clearly that any woman who's 40 and who walks into your clinic, let us take it as an opportunity to screen her for osteoporosis. While the Endocrinological Society, that is since 2020, has made this age as 50 years, but as you very clearly said, our Indian women have practiced 10 to 20 years prior to the Caucasian women. So for us, as an IMS guideline, at 40 and above, asymptomatic woman who comes to our clinic should be screened. Now, question is, how do we actually screen it? It should be very cost effective, because if you're looking at a huge population, if you're doing the screening, doing just DEXA for everyone is not going to be cost effective. So as clinicians, we need to take a history, which has been very well already talked about. We need to do a clinical examination. We need to identify the high risk factors. And based on this, we can use the 2 scores. Now, there are 3 scores, FRAX, we all have heard, and I'm sure Dr. Rajiv is going to talk about in much detail. But we need to know the 2 very simple scores, that is called the OSTA and the other one which we refer to as the SCORE. The OSTA stands for Osteoporosis Self-Assessment Tool for Asians. It only uses 2 factors, that's weight in kg, age, that is in years, and it multiplies with a decimal of 0.2. It moderates risks into 3 factors. It's a low risk.
You might as well go ahead and tell us about the OSTA and the SCORE also, Dr. Jyoti.
I think simultaneously we'll continue since it's the same. So when I was talking about the OSTA score, it is basically for Asian women. And this score had been evaluated in 2001 when it came for the first time. It's been re-evaluated in 2017. And it takes only two factors, that's a weight in kgs, age in years, into 0.2, divides into low, moderate, and high risk. The low risk, we say, if anything, is found to be greater than -1. If it is moderate risk, it's between -1 and -4. And if it is severe risk, it's more than -4. So based on this, they have been able to find that this being a screening test, it has got a very high sensitivity to the tune of 91%, while its specificity, as any other screening test, is a little low, about 50%. So it is compared to the other scores, when they compared it to FRAX, when they compared it to the other score that they used, they found it to be extremely, I would say, comparable to these particular scores. And it's a very simple score, which we can very easily do it on our particular mobile phones and calculate for ourselves. The second score I would like to talk about is the score. It is called itself the score, which is simple calculated osteoporosis risk assessment. Now this has more factors. It is using age, it is using race, weight, estrogen use. Did you have a fracture in the past? Is there any rheumatoid arthritis? It can be very easily calculated on a mobile. And as the other Oster score, this also has got a good sensitivity, but it's comparatively low specificity. Now the score risk over here is 0 to 6, low risk, 6 to 15, moderate risk, and 16 to 50, it is high. Now it is easy to risk that it's low risk, moderate, or high risk. What does it actually mean to us gynecologists? If the patient is at low risk, she has only 3% chances of developing osteoporosis. But if she is a moderate risk, such particular patient should be referred to get a BMD and to get a DEXA scan to be able to assess what exactly is her, that is a bone mass, whether she's an osteopenia or she's present in osteoporosis. So that is the importance of the two scores, very simple to carry out. We all can do it in our particular clinics. And these are comparable to the FRAX and the other scores and can be used as a criteria for defining for the BMD. So this is what I would like to say, that each one of us has to be tuned, that any patient 40 asymptomatic walking into a clinic, we need to think, we need to ask, and we need to counsel for osteoporosis. Thank you, Dr. Chitra.
So as an orthopedic surgeon, I know you follow the OSTA and the score, but we don't really do that. We actually, for all patients who come to us with fragility fractures or those who are of a certain age, especially post-menopause, we straight away go for a bone density check. But before that, understand, and I'm sure we all know, that the different investigations that are done for bone density, not only the plain X-ray, which used to be done in the past, where you use what is called the Singh-Many index to look for osteoporosis, but the DEXA scan is basically a two-dimensional. It's a mass per square centimeter. So if you want the real volume, you need a CT test, a CT density check. That is the actual way to check it. Okay, the quantitative CT we call it. But we do the DEXA scan, and the DEXA scan is usually indicated for females more than 65, post-menopausal with risk factors, or those who are perimenopausal who have risk factors. And for males above 70 years, even if they don't have risk factors, if they are between 50 and 70, then if they have risk factors. But any patient who has got a fracture of the hip, or whether it's a neck or femur fracture or an intervertebral fracture, will undergo a DEXA scan from our point of view. And some indications which are relative are those with fracture spine or chronic backache or possible osteoporotic fracture spine, or a height loss, or a height loss of say more than 1.5 inch over 12 months in total, or about half an inch happening in the last 4 to 5 months. So that's when we do a DEXA scan. The FRAX is basically a WHO sort of tool which is done online, when we actually check for the risk of a fracture happening in the next 10 years. So it's not like downloadable on your device, but you can actually go online and you can go to this website and you can actually enter in the data that you want of the person that you're getting a fracture risk assessment done for. Usually it's postmenopausal women or men who are above age of 70, or those who've been diagnosed through DEXA, or who have actually not taken any osteoporotic medication in the past. And then we enter the different the values for the age, for the sex, of course, females being more prone to developing osteoporosis, the weight, the height, the body mass index, any previous history of a fracture, specifically a fractured hip, whether there's been smoking, whether there's been steroid use or rheumatoid arthritis in the patient itself or in the family, or in any secondary osteoporosis because of glucocorticoid use or more of alcohol. And after entering all the data, then we actually enter the data on that online score, and we get a score ultimately, and that is then used to tell us what is the risk in percentage of the person developing a fracture in the next 10 years. That's what we normally use for fracture risk assessment.
Okay, is Dr. Chitra back? Dr. Deepika, is Dr. Chitra back on the screen?
Yes, ma'am, Dr. Chitra is there, but audio, I don't know if her audio is working.
Okay, basically, I think people would want to know when, whether there are any contraindications for bone mineral density testing.
I'd asked that.
Dr. Chitra, I lost you.
Yeah, I'd asked that. Actually, I think Rajiv could, I was not audible at that time.
Okay,
So,
I can read it out for you. I mean, it's on.
It's on the
right
screen.
now.
So
Sujata,
everyone
I
knows.
was going to ask Sujata this. When is BMD contraindicated?
Yeah, actually, there is no absolute contraindication except for pregnancy, nothing else. All the other factors are just limitations, and you probably would have to delay the test in these situations where, if a patient is not able to lie down properly, and if she's too obese or very grossly underweight, the measurements may not be taken properly, or if she has some implants in the site of where you want to take the DEXA test. As you know, the DEXA test is mainly done in 3 sites. So in those 3 sites, if there are any implants or any metallic things, then you have it's a limitation for the DEXA test. And or if there's a lot of degeneration in that area where you want to take measurement. So absolute contraindication is only pregnancy, nothing else.
Should one get DEXA for all? Yuvakshi?
So actually, Dr. Rajiv has already told us about it.
That's this, I know. Okay, fine. So let's come on to the first case. Dr. Shaila, Mrs. Z, 64-year-old, menopausal for 12 years, has come to you with burning micturition and vaginal dryness. She has a waddling gait, says she has a hip and lower back pain. She's constantly pulling up her salwar, says it keeps getting under her feet. Any suspicion, and what investigations need to be done? Shaila?
You'll have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Okay. So now I think I'm audible. So thank you, ma'am, for asking this question. She is actually having urogenital symptoms, as well as far as her history and examination details tell us, she is having reduction in the length of her limbs also, which is strongly suggesting that she might be having fracture neck or femur. Secondly, she is complaining of backache also, so there is suspicion of fracture vertebra also. So regarding investigations, so much has been discussed. Apart from general and routine investigations, her urine interrogation for culture sensitivity, she should be getting one X-ray pelvis, X-ray lumbosacral spine, and if the case dictates further, CT and MRI can also be done. Of course, Dr. Rajiv is raising eyebrows, so maybe he has something to add on. And yes, DEXA to assess bone mineral density. So over to you, Dr. Rajiv, because I really want to know.
Unmute.
I just did that. Sorry. I think you more or less answered from the orthopedic point of view. Definitely a pelvis with both hips X-ray to look for any looser zones, basically, or any stress fractures in the neck of the femur or in the upper part of the femur, and a spine X-ray, as you said correctly, to look for any osteoporotic collapses of the dorsolateral junction. And apart from that, usually we don't get CT scans done unless and until the patient, say, for example, has unexplained pain and cannot walk for any reason. So I would reserve the CT scan because that's a little bit of a more radiation than you would want the patient to undergo. And MRIs are usually only recommended if they're looking at some neurological issues. So you're right, I mean, but not for every patient.
Yeah, thank you. So over to you, ma'am, Chitra ma'am.
this and we on to the next one. Dr. Michi?
Yes, ma'am. So coming to the fundamental measures for maintaining bone health, basically a healthy lifestyle which includes a healthy balanced diet and a good amount of exercise with the good exposure to sunlight, then avoiding of alcohol, smoking, and at that age, you know, nutritional supplements like calcium supplements, vitamin D measures, and if less, vitamin D supplementation, and basically, you know, walking and wearing clothes which are comfortable, shoes which are comfortable, all these help maintain a good bone health. That's it, ma'am.
So exercise, especially resistance, balance, and weight bearing. Avoid falling. A lot the elderly age group, jumping rope, stair climbing, tennis, and these I found very nice and very surgery, hip extension, hip flexion, shoulder strengthening, bicep, maybe a half kg or 1 kg weight. Rajiv, what do you say about this?
Yeah, so Dr. Chitra, I think all of us are in need of exercise, considering that we've all been locked down for such a long time, even though the gynecologists have been working overtime. But you're right, all of these exercises are something we recommend for every single patient.
Okay, so you basically want to know about calcium supplementation. So actually there is a lot of conflicting data on calcium supplementation. It's not so easy just saying, oh, you're postmenopausal, so you please take a lot of calcium. That's not the way it is. Agreed, now with the lack of estrogen, as you attain menopause, the lady is unable to retain the dietary calcium. So that is why the supplements are required. But even then, there is a limit to it because there is an element of risk-benefit ratio that has to be discussed. So a normal postmenopausal woman would require a minimum of 800 to about 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams of calcium per day. And of course, in certain situations, she might need more, but she should not exceed 2,000 milligrams per day because then it has negative effects, like it can reduce the absorption of iron, magnesium, and zinc. So it is very important to know that you don't overdo it. So you should know what you are taking in your diet. In fact, our Indian Menopausal Society guidelines has given very clearly how much calcium, milligrams of calcium you get from milk when you take 250 ml of milk. You get about 300 milligrams of calcium when you take 100 grams of paneer, how much calcium. So there is a chart there given in the guideline, which tells you how much of dietary calcium you are having per day. So then the remaining amount of calcium you should supplement with your tablets. Now, calcium can be in two forms, citrate and carbonate. So you should remember that the carbonate form is preferably taken with the meal because it requires the acid secretions to help in absorption of the carbonate. Whereas calcium citrate can be taken on an empty stomach. So anybody who's on proton inhibitors, proton pump inhibitors, etc., those candidates should not take calcium carbonate because then it cannot get absorbed. And it should not be taken together with other drugs. Like you should not take it with the drug or with the steroid drug. It should have a gap. And calcium beyond 500 milligrams cannot be absorbed. So it is always better to take it in divided doses. So I think the risk part, when you overdo it and take too much of calcium, there are a lot of studies now going on whether there is a cardiovascular risk to it or whether the formation of renal calculi, and of course the common complaint of constipation, etc., which is more with calcium carbonate. So you should know not cross the limits of taking calcium and take the amount which you need more after your dietary intake. And there is it is very uncertain whether calcium per se reduces the fracture risk. It just reduces bone loss. But reducing fracture risk may be with vitamin D, but not alone. And these are independent medicines. They are not equivalent to the treatment of osteoporosis, which is all the other pharmacological drugs that have to be given. Thank you. I think Dr. Jyoti, you can tell us about the vitamin D part, because I've told them about the calcium, and maybe you could tell us about the vitamin D.
Okay, so I'll go on to the next. As you said, calcium, along with that, vitamin D is very important. Now, exactly why do we need vitamin D? We all know, we all feel that vitamin D is only required for the calcium absorption, but we need to understand it has got several other roles to play. It is very important for the muscle performance. You would find that the women who are unable to get from their particular seats, who are unable to get up from the chairs, are the ones who are having proximal muscle weaknesses, and that is mainly because of vitamin D. It's also very important for the balance, for the risk of decreasing the risk of falling. It's very important also to improve the functioning, or we say effectivity, of the biphosphonate. Now, question is then, how much of vitamin D should one take? Now, there are two sources. One would say that they are dietary, or we would say sunlight as one source, and the second is that we are going to supplement it. Now, if we say about the sunlight, they say that if you're sitting from 10 to 3 p.m. in the sunlight, you're exposing 15 to 20% of your body, you may gain about 350 to 500 international units per day. But that depends upon the age, it depends upon the color, the latitude, the pollution. There are a lot of very factors, so you cannot be too sure that if you're sitting in the sunlight, you're actually gaining so much of vitamin D. When it comes to food, we know none of the foods do give us vitamin D, but yes, we're talking about fortification of the food. That is milk. If you tend to fortify, yes, you'll be able to get the one. But it is said that you have to drink 700 ml of milk to be able to get as little as, I would say, about 200 to 300 international units. But today, 700 means about 3 glasses of milk. No woman is going to be drinking 3 glasses of milk. So what are we left with? We are left only with supplemental iron. So the one that we're going to give is vitamin D, which is cholecalciferol. What amount and what do we need in the blood? We need a level of more than 30 nanograms per ml. Something between 30 to 50 is what we desire. If we want to have that particular level, we are talking about a maintenance therapy, which is 1,000 to 2,000 international units of cholecalciferol to be given daily with milk. It can be given in the form of capsules. It can be given in the form of liquids. You can take it off to that. But if a woman is deficient, that means she's less than 30, then it's not just a maintenance. You have to give her a treatment dose. The treatment dose would be 60,000 units weekly for a period of 8 to 12 weeks, depending on how much the deficiency is there. After you have completed this course, when you move on to the maintenance, which is 1,000 to 2,000 international units. But we need to understand that the total maximum dose that we can give is only 4,000 units. We should not exceed 4,000 units per day. So it doesn't mean that you're giving 60,000 weekly, plus you're giving 1,000, 2,000, because you're giving calcium. They all have got the vitamin D also. So it should not go more than 4,000 units per day. So that is, but if a woman is obese, she has malabsorption syndrome, maybe the dose that may be required would be much longer. So vitamin D, as the question goes, supplement for all. I would say for postmenopausal, nearly everyone would require supplementation unless and until we have got a vitamin D level which goes above 50, then we say no, you are not getting extra supplements. But otherwise, at least maintenance dose of 1,000 to 2,000 has to be given daily. That's it. Thank you. So I think Dr. Chitra is still not connected.
No, I think she's connected now. Dr. Chitra?
Sorry, I think there was something wrong with my internet connection.
Yeah.
So it went for a 6.
Yeah, good to have you back.
Yeah.
You just pull and patch up.
Yeah. One point I wanted to add on the calcium thing, that if you have a chart, this was in the Indian Menopause Society guidelines, you had a chart on what are the normal food available. So there are lots of patients who come and say that I've got stones, I'm not going to take calcium. And I've got a history of passing stones. So if you know what are the normal food, which has a very high calcium content, and you can give them these foods, I mean, just ensure that their diet is rich in all this, it adds a lot to, to your counseling part. I think Jyoti has talked about vitamin D. Vitamin K is another thing for women of postmenopausal age Our
Yes,
current
yes.
RDA of vitamin K is required. Both bone and cardiovascular health are improved with vitamin K. Now, who needs pharmacological therapy? Dr. Yuvakshi?
Already been emphasized that an early diagnosis is very, very important for an early intervention and to prevent long-term morbidity. But we must remember that we are not just treating the T-score of a patient. We must make a complete clinical assessment with a very carefully taken history before we take any decision for pharmacotherapy. And it is indicated when the bone mineral density is between, as per DEXA, done on spine, neck or wrist, is neck or femur, wrist or on the spine, is worse than minus 2.5. It is also indicated for women with low bone mass with a T-score between -1 to 2.5 who have one major risk factor for osteoporosis or 2 or more minor risk factors. Now, it should also be offered to women who are eligible or who are in the high risk score of osteoporosis as per the self-assessment tools like OSTA, FRAX or SCORE. And if there is on X-ray, if there is even in asymptomatic women, if there is evidence of fragility factor or fractures, or there is kyphosis, or there are vertebral compression fractures, or there is history of height loss of more than 4 centimeter, pharmacotherapy should be offered to these women.
What are the commonly prescribed drugs? Now we go on to Dr. Rajiv. He's going to tell us about what are the commonly prescribed drugs. And also, I mean, do we give them indefinitely or is there a time limit for the pharmacotherapy?
Okay, so this is something that we as orthopedic surgeons and endocrinologists actually like to do. And you guys obviously should also be involved, because when the patient is perimenopausal, then we do not get so aggressive, because we normally wait for the gynecologist to continue her estrogen therapy or the hormone therapy or the hormone analog before we actually start the patient on actual pharmacotherapy. So once we've assessed the patient and once we realize that this patient is postmenopausal and cannot benefit so much by hormone therapy as given by the gynecologist, then we talk about the newer drugs that are available, and the foremost amongst them is the anti-resorptive group of drugs. Am I audible? Okay.
Yes, yes, yes.
All right. So there are a few of these. There are some of them which are given once a week, like alendronate or risodronate. Then there is ibandronate, which is given once a month orally or once in 3 months by injection. And there is zoledronic acid, which is given as an IV infusion once a year. So depending upon I would use the word, the kind of patient that comes to us, whether the patient is going to follow up regularly, whether the patient is very, very compliant in terms of following the therapy, we prescribe one of these anti-resorptives, usually along with vitamin D and calcium supplements. There are some patients who unfortunately will not benefit so much, or they won't have much improvement in their bone density just on the basis of bisphosphonates, because we are trying to give them for a period of about 3 years, which is contrary to what most American or British societies talk about. They talk about giving it for about 5 years before they give a drug holiday of a year. But we as orthopedic surgeons usually follow the American Academy Orthopedic Society guidelines or the British Society guidelines. And we are worried about them having fractures related to bisphosphonate therapy, which are very tough to treat and which require not only the surgical treatment but additional bone grafting. So we would normally continue these for a period of about 3 years and then take a drug holiday. During that drug holiday, we would substitute by giving some alternative method of treatment, like the rank ligand inhibitor, which is denosumab. You might have heard of the brand name Prolia, but that's basically a drug which was initially used for cancer treatment, and now it's given once in 6 months as a subcutaneous injection. So that is another newer drug that is available. Then of course there's calcitonin, which is given either as a nasal spray or intramuscular injection, but that is predominantly given for the relief of pain which occurs due to osteoporotic fractures. For example, if the patient is complaining of severe back pain along with the osteoporotic fracture, or severe pelvic pain because of a pelvis fracture, the pubic rami fracture, then we add calcitonin. so as to regulate calcium and vitamin D metabolism and provide relief of pain. So we normally give that for about a month or two. Estrogen therapy and tissue-specific estrogen complex therapy, I do not know much about, so I leave it to the better learned people out here, that is you guys. But I'll talk a little bit about the anabolic agents, really. So the anabolic agents are the sclerostin inhibitors, romosozumab, AQQG, which is basically, again, not available in our country. It's a subcutaneous injection given once a month, again for osteoporosis, but predominantly it's used to increase bone mass, not just prevent bone mass resorption, which the earlier group of drugs sort of does. And of course, the ones that are used most commonly for patients nowadays are the parathormone analogs, which are, of course, contraindicated in cancer or any form of tumor. So these are teriparatide and teriparatide analogs. So parathyroid hormone related protein analogs like abaloparatide or teriparatide are given as subcutaneous injections once a day. And we normally continue them continuously for about a year and a half, because we try to keep this medicine as the last medicine in our armamentarium, because once you use them, you don't want to use them again. So even though, again, endocrinological societies talk about this drug being given for about 2 years, we normally stop it at 1.5 years, because we otherwise raise the risk of some form of cancer developing, even if there is an early mitotic change, whether it is in the breast or in the uterus or wherever.
Okay. I add about Tibolon. It has an estrogenic effect on bone, inhibiting bone resorption by reducing osteoclastic activity. And it is prescribed in a single daily dose of 2.5, but even 1.25 has been found to be equally effective for most indications, including osteoporosis. It increases lumbar spine and total hip BMD and does not increase the risk of venous thrombosis and CVD events, and does not induce endometrial hyperplasia. So the risk of endometrial carcinoma in postmenopausal women is decreased with it, and it may be preferable to hormonal therapy in symptomatic menopausal women with mammographically dense breast tissue. But it should not be used in breast cancer survivors, as it increases the recurrence risk. It reduces the risk of breast cancer in postmenopausal women and those who do not have a family history or not particularly prone to breast cancer. Should be used with caution in women over 60 and should not be used in those who have a strong risk factors for stroke. Okay, is there a time limit for pharmacotherapy, Rajiv?
I thought I sort of answered that, but I'll just visit it once.
Yeah.
What we normally say is that after 3 years of bisphosphonate therapy, as orthopedic surgeons, we give a drug holiday of a year. Even though recommendations in endocrinological societies and the International Osteoporosis Foundation recommends 5 years of bisphosphonate therapy, we don't, because we are worried about these very specific fractures which are difficult to treat in those patients who've taken long-term bisphosphonate therapy. So we would prefer to sort of stop after 3 years and then give a drug holiday. In that interim period, we normally convert either to parathyroid hormone on analog, or we convert to denosumab, which is now available, and then come back to bisphosphonates. So normally we take it for 3 years. As far as denosumab is concerned, the rank ligand inhibitors, they can be given every 6 months till life. There is no restriction in terms of their use. And as far as teriparatide or the PTH analogs are concerned, even though recommendations by the endocrinological societies are 2 years maximum, we normally stop at about 1.5 years in practical day-to-day practice.
Okay. What is the role of hormone therapy in prevention of osteoporosis? And if so, when do we start? Dr. Shaila?
Yes, ma'am. There is definitely a role of hormone therapy in prevention of osteoporosis. And if you're asking me when to start, so I would like to say that whenever we are getting any opportunity to utilize those hormones to increase the bone mineral deposits in our body, we should start. And that starts at an early age, as early as adolescence age group. In addition to that, we should use our hormones when we are still having it. So during reproductive age, we should resort to moderate weight-bearing exercises. We should try to, change our lifestyles, have protein intake.
No, that we have discussed. Yeah. I'm talking only about hormone therapy. When do we start that?
So if we go by the guidelines, we should be starting it within the 10 years of start of menopause, and definitely less than 60 years of age. There are 2 pointers when we might get a hint that we might be needing hormone therapy in these age groups at an earlier stage, as described by Jyoti Madam beautifully. We should be assessing the risk at the age of as early as 40 years. But if a woman is landing into perimenopausal transition to menopause with history of infrequent cycles and scanty menstruation, scanty menstrual bleed, that is a pointer that she might be deficient in estrogen, so we can catch up those females. And secondly, definitely in those patients which are having premature ovarian failure or premature ovarian insufficiency, or where we have taken out ovaries due to any reason, we should be adding hormone therapy in such patients.
Yeah. So if it is given below the age of 60 years or within 10 years of menopause, the risks are extremely rare. Now, any special precautions while prescribing hormone therapy, Dr. Mitti?
The special precautions when we prescribe the hormone therapy, we must take a detailed history, ruling out any family history of cancers or knowing whether the patient per se is a cancer survivor. Then in examination, we must rule out the blood pressure, and we must have the other basic routine blood tests like the thyroid, the diabetes status. We must do a thorough cardiac checkup and know about the cardiac status, the lipid profile, and mammography is a must before we prescribe the patient any HRT.
Okay. Anybody else wants to add on? Jyoti, Sujata?
No, mainly the cardiovascular and the breast. The history is very important.
Yeah. And any special precautions while giving, prescribing hormone therapy?
I think the special precautions that we are talking about at present is that we have to be very particular that we have counseled the patient very well about the risks and the benefits before we tend to start this.
Yeah.
Secondly, we need to know whether the uterus is there or not. That is extremely important. If uterus is not there, then estrogen alone is good enough. But if there is a uterus, we have to provide them with progesterone. We cannot be ruling them out without progesterone is there. And of course, if there's 6 months when they are on particular treatment, even if they have bleeding off and on, nothing much needs to be done. But we can just counsel them and tell them everything is going to be fine. But if after 6 months also they tend to continue with bleeding off and on, she needs to be evaluated. We need to do an ultrasound, we need to do an endometrial biopsy, and to rule out that it is not an endometrial cancer or any of these hyperplasias we are particularly dealing with. And yes, we need to keep calling them for a follow-up. The follow-up is very important in these particular patients. 1 month later, we come and ask them they're okay with the medication. Do they have any side effects? Then at 3 months again, and then at 6 months, and after that annually. And at each of the follow-ups, apart from asking how they're doing, do they have any side effects? It's important to take the blood pressure of these patients. It's important to measure their BMI. See if they're up to date as far as the mammography and the pap smear has been done. If not, then we need to repeat these particular patients. So
One more thing they've said that when you're giving progesterones, if instead of giving oral progesterones, you can even put in a Mirena. For these patients, that can act very well for non-hysterectomized patients on hormone therapy.
Yeah, and another thing about progesterone is the type of progesterone that we're going to be using. That is very important. So previously, all the studies of WHI that had been used, they had used MPA, that's medroxyprogesterone acetate, and all the complications which were actually reported to that. But at present, all the guidelines say that the natural progesterones are the ones that are best to be utilized. So if we can use the natural progesterones or the dydrogesterone, a combination that can be, they are considered to have much less risk of breast cancer, and they're associated with much less problems associated with that. And Marina, as you did say.
Yeah, true. Is there any time limit for prescribing hormone therapy, Sujata?
Yeah, like it has already been covered. The most important thing is 2/3 of the bone loss occurs within the first 10 years of menopause. Like in the first year, it's about 6 to 10%, and then about 14 to 15% in the second year. So with every 10% of bone loss, there is a double risk there is a fracture risk, the fracture risk doubles. So that is why it's very important that you give the hormone therapy in the first 10 years of menopause. And the upper limit is the age of 60. If anybody wants to continue after that, then the risk-benefit factor should come in and be discussed with the person.
Yeah. And any duration of use?
The 10 years.
I think Dr. Sujata has very clearly highlighted that, of course, we need to use it till it is needed. It should not be beyond it is needed. But if you have to go beyond that, that is what we talk about extended, then it has to be a shared decision between the patient and us explaining all the risks and benefits, because the latest guidelines have not set an upper limit. They do not say that you have to withdraw 65, 70. It says just that if you have explained the risks and benefits, please continue as long as you wished. That's the thing.
That's what it says. The role of extended use is a shared decision between the woman and the physician, and may be considered in cases of recurrence of symptoms after stopping therapy, and also in management of osteoporosis when other therapies are indicated. And tapering off, you may be abrupt, or the dose and duration may be tapered off gradually. Okay, now we come to the second case, Dr. Jyoti. Mrs. X, 41-year-old, attained menopause 1 year back. Family history, mother had a fractured neck femur at 60 years of age. She is worried and has come to you for your opinion as to whether she should start hormone therapy. If so, for how long? She's 41.
Yeah. So she's 41. We would say she's in early menopause, as you had shown the particular slide. She's not premature menopause, but she's early menopause, because in our country, we would say 46 is the years of menopause.
Yeah.
Second factor that if you have a look at it, when we're talking of a risk factor, there's a parental history of a fractured neck. So that is one of the major risk factors she has. So she's got two factors. That's an early menopause, and secondly, she has got a risk factor of the fracture. So if we are going to give her an that is MHT, we should be very clear why we are giving her an MHT. According to all the guidelines, there are only 4 indications when we can give a patient a hormonal replacement therapy. One of them is, of course, vasomotor symptoms, which she has not complained. The other one is vulvovaginal symptoms, which she has not complained. The third is prevention of the bone loss, which, yes, is important in her case. And fourth, of course, is premature. She qualifies somewhere because she's an early menopause. So this patient is a good candidate for giving a hormonal replacement therapy. Prior to that, of course, we should get a DEXA done to be able to see whether she lies in osteopenia or she's already osteoporotic, because her mother also has, so maybe she's already at low bone mass. So even if she's an osteopenia, that's between T -1 to 2.5 plus 1 high risk factor, she qualifies for a medication to prevent the further deterioration. So definitely an HT is to be given to her. Because she has a uterus, I would like to give her a combined HT, which would include estrogen and the progesterone. The one that I would use is a continuous, because she's already 1 year post-menopause. The second choice, of course, we do have Tibolone, which Dr. Chitra had already spoken. It's a matter of choice whether you use Tibolone or you use the MHT. The second question then we say is, for how long am I going to give this particular one? As far as you ask me, and if you see what the FDA tends to say, I would like to give her the MHT till the age of menopause. That would be till the age of 46. At the age of 46, I would reassess this patient, get a DEXA done for her, and then reassess her risk. If she still has a higher risk of osteoporosis and has no contraindication to be giving non-estrogenic preparations like biphosphonates, I would probably counsel her to move on to the biphosphonates, because she doesn't have any other indication for continuing her MHT, that is VMA, or she does not have VBS. So maybe I've got a little confusing. What I would say for this patient is I would give her MHT till the age of natural menopause. That's till the age of 46 to 47 years. Reassess this patient. Consider her for changing over to biphosphonates only for the prevention of bone loss. If she does develop other symptoms, then I would continue with the MHT till the age of 60 years.
True. Along with that, inadequate counseling about exercise, nutrition, calcium, vitamin D, all those.
Yes.
We'll go on.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the second case, Mrs. Y, 35 years, underwent an LABH with BSO in view of fibroid uterus with menorrhagia with a family history of CA ovary. After 6 months, had a fall with a hairline fracture. Again, after a year, had an accident with a fracture head radius. Vitamin D was 3 international units, FSH was 68, was sent by an orthopedic surgeon for a gynae reference. What is your opinion, Dr. Mitti? And Dr. Rajiv, you're the orthopedic surgeon. So both of you have to give a combined answer.
So for this patient, she's got an iatrogenic menopause at the age of 35, and she also has a history of cancer in the family. But we should have anticipated that she, with one fracture, that she is a high risk for osteoporosis. And keeping that in mind, she should have been adequately counseled for an HRT. So I think she is a candidate for the hormonal therapy. That is only estrogen because she doesn't have the uterus. So we could give her that along with doing all the basic investigations which is needed.
And the orthopedic answer to that is that since she has answered what we would actually refer the patient to the gynecologist for.
Okay. Fine. I think then she warrants this thing. And CA ovary is not a contraindication to hormonal therapy. So again, we have to just review her more frequently and follow up. Now, just to summarize now the whole thing, the pharmacological options can be hormonal therapy, non-hormonal therapy, and other complementary therapy and alternative therapies. This was a good chart, an algorithm, which was found hysterectomy or Mirena in situ. Then if it is yes, then you can give estrogen only, either oral estradiol or conjugated estrogens, or it can be transdermal gel or patch. Indications for transdermal therapy are individual preference, poor symptom control with oral GI disorder affecting oral absorption. Lots of people can't tolerate estrogen. Previous or family history of VTE, BMI greater than 30, variable blood pressure control, migraine, current use of medications that induce hepatic enzymes or gallbladder disease. And if it is no, that means then you can give estrogen plus progesterone. If it's perimenopausal, then sequential therapy, either oral or transdermal. And postmenopausal, then you give a continuous combined period-free transdermal. This was the summary of the treatment as provided by the Indian Menopausal Society guidelines. All of you should read that. They are fantastic guidelines. 2019, it covers menopause completely and has dealt with hormonal therapy, has dealt especially with bone health. Postmenopausal women with fragility factor, intermediate pain relief, surgical management, calcium, vitamin D, investigations to rule out secondary causes, follow-up, a multidisciplinary management. You do the BMD of the spine, hip, radius by DEXA, repeat after 1 to 2 years, markers for monitoring therapy. After this, you move to pharmacotherapy, either teriparatide, denosumab, or calcitonin or biphosphonates. Physiotherapy, definitely. Therapeutic lifestyle management, identify the factors for recurrence, diet, rehabilitation, psychological support, calcium and vitamin D. Aim is to improve the quality of life as well as provide independence at home and at work. So the summary of recommendations will be start counseling regarding bone health early in adolescence itself, promote the intake of calcium-rich diet or supplements, minimum of 1,000 milligrams per day, as well as vitamin D of 800 international units per day. Advised to avoid smoking and excessive alcohol. Stress on the need for regular weight bearing and muscle strengthening. Assess the clinical risk factors for osteoporosis, falls, and a 10-year probability of fracture using FRAX. Screen for BMD using DEXA or ultrasound in high-risk menopausal and premenopausal and postmenopausal women. Diagnose and classify using the WHO classification. Initiate appropriate pharmacotherapy promptly along with calcium and vitamin D in therapeutic doses. Recommended drugs, biphosphonates first line, denosumab second line, parathormone for those who do not respond, calcitonin for those with pain, hormone therapy for women with proven deficiency and menopausal symptoms under the age of 60. Thank you. I think if any of our panelists wants to add any final summarization, please do.
Yeah. So Dr. Chitra, I would just like to add one thing, because we had been dealing with premature menopause. We had that case of 35 years who underwent an LVH. But we can have such patients without a surgical, who may have a uterus and with maybe a natural premature menopause.
True.
So in such particular cases, we have an option. I think maximum people, we have an option of either putting her, I think or putting her on MHT or COCs. because I've seen that many of us have been using COCs in these patients till the age of natural menopause.
Yeah.
But the evidence very clearly says that if you're giving it for the bone health, it is always better to replace it with estradiol plus progesterone.
True.
So we have these combinations which are available because the dose we require is about 2 milligram of estradiol tolerate. And COCs are giving us much, much higher dose. As Dr. Manju Khemani had also shown in that the dose we give with COC is very high and which is not needed. So I think in such patients, better option is to put them on estrogens plus progesterone instead of COCs till the age of menopause. That's what I wanted to add.
Yeah, really true. Anyone else?
Very good, Chitra. It was a very good discussion.
There are 1 or 2 questions we can take. Does taking milk prevent osteoporosis? Well, milk gives the calcium. It doesn't prevent osteoporosis, but it is one of the nutritional supplements. There is another one which says recently there is a news that incidence of osteoporosis is no different in groups who take milk and who don't take what? Who don't take it. What is the panel opinion?
Dr. Sujata, you need to unmute yourself. Dr. Sujata is trying to say something, but she's muted.
I think the milk is necessary because at least it gives you 300 to 500 milligrams of dietary calcium. So I think it is required. I only learned one thing, that buffalo's milk has more calcium than cow's milk, which was something I didn't know.
Yeah,
it's given
true. And it's quite a bit more.
200 milligrams more.
Yes, 200 milligrams more. Then there's a question, can you prescribe Tibolone in a 38-year-old female with BSO done but with intact uterus?
Yes, of course, Tibolone can be given.
Of course you can prescribe Tibolone.
Yeah, you can. ET thickness cutoff in women on HRT.
I think it's 4 millimeters for anything.
Yeah.
Now with HRT it changes. Whenever your patient is on HRT, we say it comes out to be 8 millimeters. You can leave it for 8 millimeters. As per the
8
guidelines.
millimeters. I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what can be there? But if a patient is bleeding, we
then
don't
definitely the biopsy is required.
To monitor the endometrial biopsy. Only if they're bleeding, then we need to do a biopsy. Otherwise, 8 millimeter asymptomatic is acceptable.
Yeah.
Okay.
Should we
I think
assess
Dr.
her?
Rajiv wants to say something. Dr. Rajiv.
Yeah, I just want to sort of emphasize to everybody out here that osteoporosis is not just about calcium or vitamin D. It's a lot about protein.
Yeah.
So in our country, we have this in large quantities because our diet is actually quite poor, not only in calcium and vitamin D, but also in protein. So somewhere we have to stress that women in our country should be given excess protein, so that they must use that protein, so they must exercise regularly. So I think that is something I would like to sort of add as my little bit input, if you want, from the author.
Yes, because we have the condition called sarcopenia, which indirectly influences the bone strength. So sarcopenia is lack of protein. So we need to take the protein.
And also exercise so that we have bone growth and cutting down
when we talk about bone mass per se, we talk about a matrix which is made of protein into which we have calcification by calcium. So we need to have that matrix which is solid first, and that we can build up over time up to the age of about 25 to 30 years where you reach your peak bone mass. Because after that, you're only going to lose it. So we need to insist and ensure right from the time we actually see the little child or the boy or the girl in the OPD, even if they're not really, in your or my practice directly, but insist on having good diet in addition to exercise.
True. And vitamin D also plays an important part in this, because we forget that vitamin D, as dark-skinned people, our absorption of vitamin D is less. And every literature says maximum vitamin D absorption is between 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. minus sunscreen, exposure of arms, forearms, neck, and face. How many people are in the sun at that time? So that is also one added addition. Then, should we assess the risk of fracture before starting her treatment of HRT?
Yes. Yes, I think every patient who walks into your clinic, we have to assess for osteoporosis.
We have to assess every patient.
But HRT alone is never given for prevention of bone loss. The main indications of giving HRT is only VMS and BVA, prevention of bone loss if other biphosphonates are the first line of treatment. And if they have other symptoms, only then HRT to give.
Yes. For menopause at 40 years, should we give OCPs till the age of 47? Then she will have cyclical bleeding. What are the comments?
I think this is what I said at that time.
spoke on this.
Yeah. Instead of COCs, it's much better to give them estrogen and progesterone combinations or tibolone.
True.
They are better options than COC. But yes, patients are more happy taking COCs because they bleed every month. They're confident they're not going to get pregnant. True. Because they can be freak pregnancy of 5% even with the premature menopause.
True.
But yes, advocate.
And they feel they're still young when they are bleeding.
Yes, yes. But even if you are using the 1/10, that is the one that is your estradiol 1 milligram plus 10 milligram Defastone, they also you tend to have bleeding every month. So they can be used in these particular patients.
True. Okay. For calcitriol versus cholecalciferol in menopause.
I think Dr. Rajiv will answer that.
Rajiv.
Okay. Sorry. I'll also get myself on. So, I mean, to be honest, I have not really found too much of a difference for a normal patient or for patients with menopause between the two, but I would prefer to give them the activated form. So I normally give them cholecalciferol.
Okay.
Actually, our guidelines also say cholecalciferol.
Yeah, guidelines also say cholecalciferol.
You have a good functioning kidney and you have sort of good dietary intake of calcium, then your calcitriol also will get converted to cholecalciferol. So the first step of conversion from calcitriol to 1-hydroxy and then 1,25-hydroxy cholecalciferol is through the skin and through the kidney. So,
there's a question which says in asymptomatic patients, when should prophylactic bone resorption measures should be started except calcium and vitamin D?
So I think she's talking about anti-resorptive. Basically.
Yeah, anti-resorptive
bisphosphonates. So I think Dr. Jyoti has answered that very well.
Yeah.
She said that you, up to the age of natural menopause, you can give an attempt of hormone therapy, especially if you know that there aren't any risk factors for estrogen. And if you find there is a high risk for estrogen, then you can start on bisphosphonates.
Yeah. It's also said, should hormone therapy be used only for prevention of osteoporosis at age 46 to 47 or natural menopause? No, we were talking in this session, we are talking about bone health. The indications for hormone therapy for other indications in menopause remain the same. This, we didn't discuss all those indications because this particular discussion was only on bone health. But the other indications stand, where you need very severe vasomotor symptoms are one very important thing, where hormone therapy is used. I think we've dealt with most of the... Please name some of the combination of MHT available in India.
Okay, I think the MHT that's available in India is only one, and we are lucky to have it very recently for it to have come. And that is, I know it's the other company, but we're speaking of the other company that we have. So it's available by the name of Femistorm, which has got estradiol valivate. It's got estradiol hemihydrate, 1 milligram plus Defastone 10 milligrams. That is the one which we're giving to young patients. That's a premature menopause, a very early menopause. For the continuous therapy, we have got 1/5, that is 1 milligram of estradiol hemihydrate plus 5 milligram of Defastone in all the 28 tablets. So they are the ones which are giving continuously. And of course, tibolone is available. That's the other option that we have. Rest, you can give estradiol separately and you can give your progesterone.
Progesterone in whatever way, what we've discussed already.
Yeah,
I believe some of the audience wants to ask questions. I think we can, Deepika, if you can unmute them, they can ask.
No, I don't think so. It may not be very practical, I think.
We can take 1 or 2 questions. There are 2-3 people I've unmuted. Yeah, you can
deal with that aspect.
Yeah, you can ask your question, Dr. Abha. If you want to ask, you have to unmute yourself. Dr. Shashikala, Dr. Usha Rani, Professor Rekha, anybody, Dr. Pushpa Garg. If you want to ask a question, you just unmute yourself and you can speak out. We can hear you then. I think they're not.
Yeah, I
Uh,
think it's close to switch.
yeah. Nobody's speaking out as such.
Nobody's
I've
speaking,
unmuted.
and we finished with the questions on the chat box.
Right. I think we can now end the session because although I've asked them to speak out, nobody is actually speaking up. Dr. Krishna Batra? Yes.
Excuse me, what is the dose of denosumab for osteoporosis patients?
We had put it on the slide actually.
Yeah, it's 60 milligrams given as a subcutaneous injection once every 6 months. It's available in that dose.
And can it be given to those patients who have received teriparatide for 2 years already and they've had a fracture following bisphosphonates used for a longer time?
Yes, ma'am, you're absolutely right. They are actually
I have
given
a
for those
patient
patients.
who had Actually, I had a patient who had a fracture following bisphosphonates long intake, and following which she had a non-union of fracture. She had a fracture which went into non-union, went for nearly 5-6 years. So now she's been given teriparatide for nearly 2 years or maybe 3 years. So she's worried whether she should, has to take some thing for osteoporosis, or she should not be taking any bisphosphonates or anything for the osteoporosis.
So
It's nearly 2 years now the fracture has united and the teriparatides are also off. Now, what is the line of treatment for osteoporosis right now?
So this is exactly the point I was trying to make. I was telling you that we don't give bisphosphonates for long because we end up with fractures which are very difficult to treat and end up in non-union, as you mentioned, as your patient.
Yeah, she's already suffered that.
So in this particular case, you can restart if you've given a drug holiday of about a year or two of bisphosphonates. But at this present time, since you've already given teriparatide, which is the PTH analog, you can actually go to denosumab. Denosumab can be given lifelong. There is no problem. Just make sure the creatinine clearance is under control.
Teriparatide, is there any time interval between stopping teriparatide and starting of denosumab? Because teriparatides have already stopped.
You can start it straight away. You can start it straight away.
And any side effects of denosumab or any investigation needs to be followed.
What we normally tell patients to do is to get a creatinine clearance done and look for any renal problems, basically. If there are renal issues, then you have to modify the dose. You have to go from 60 to 30 milligrams. But that's about it.
And she has to remain under some endocrinologist follow-up or something? No, she has to...
So not really, because you're giving a single injection once in 6 months. If it was a daily tablet or something, then you were looking at following up regularly for other side effects, but not for this patient.
An orthopedician can be consulted for this?
Yes, yes. Definitely, yes.
Okay. Thank
Even
you,
though, I may add this out here, denosumab actually, and even what we give drugs for rheumatoid arthritis similar to denosumab, are actually under the purview of rheumatologists for rheumatoid arthritis, but not for osteoporosis. So you can ask your orthopedic surgeon to prescribe and monitor this patient, no problem.
So should she go to a rheumatic specialist?
That would be better to save you from any medical legal issues, yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Doctor. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
I think we've overshot our time. So I'd like to thank all the panelists for being wonderful panelists and contributing so much to this panel. And thank you, Jackson Pal, for giving us an opportunity to present a panel on bone health, which is something which is rarely discussed in gynecology.
Ma'am, thank you very much. On behalf of Jackson Pal, I'd also like to take 1 minute of yours. We are the makers of Lycorate Soft Gel, the cell protector, also benefits during menopause for good bone health. And we have Endorect tablets which contain Dynogest 2 mg. That is for medical management of endometriosis. Apart from the many other brands that are already in the basket, you all know. So I'm Dr. Deepika Chhabra here, and along with my teammates, we would like to thank all the experts for sharing such immense knowledge with us today. We are truly appreciative of the presence of the attendees also, without whose support this endeavor could not have been possible. We look forward to unending support from the attendees to go a long way in knowledge sharing. And with this, we would like to thank all of you and hope to see you again in our next webinar. Thank you very much. It's a goodbye from all of us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.